Hey everybody, you just heard Jotun from Whoracle, and this is In Flames Part 2, Record Metal Podcast. I'm Mark.
And I'm Jason.
And joining us again, there you go.
There she goes.
I didn't have to prompt.
Nope.
She's got her, the green worked out of her.
Yes.
A little bit, maybe.
Speaking of green, we've got a nice green Whoracle cover.
Andreas Marshall.
Yeah, we didn't really
again.
talk about the sort of pattern of covers that In Flames starts really with Jester Race with the whatever, is it the Jester face? Can we call it that? What is the name of their logo?
Album.
Yeah, the Jester mask or something.
I think it's just referred to as the Jester face.
Kind of like their Eddie or their
But the funny thing, after they debut him, he's now gone on the next record of Whoracle.
I feel like he's probably somewhere on here. We just can't find him.
Yeah.
I have not seen him,
But I haven't looked that hard either.
I looked pretty hard
It might be on
earlier.
the inside.
I was trying to wear Waldo the thing, but yeah, Andreas Marshall had kind of like a fairly long term. Well, I guess a 3-record kind of career as being the cover artist of In Flames, but
And he's known he did some really great stuff.
He's done like Sepultura and Blind Guardian and Obituary.
There it is.
There.
That's inside though.
It's in the inside. And speaking of the inside, we were kind of commenting that, by the way, we have to we love Whoracle. It's a great record. So we're just sort of having some fun with the graphic arts part of Whoracle.
Yes.
Because Mark could comment on this because you were a graphic artist. You still are, but you were. I
was a graphic designer then. Yeah, I'm now just an illustrator, but you can see it's so evident of the trends that were happening as far as topography went, and like people were discovering, like even on the back of it, they use a force blur, which is just a Photoshop filter. Mm-hmm. Like this very obvious digital effects were thrown in, embossing logos, and all this stuff this was just kind of being like thrown out willy nilly at this point because it was easy, and you didn't have to be a graphic designer to do this stuff on these records.
Well, and there's like this really hilarious pattern that was gracing Nuclear Blast records from like '98 in this era,
Yeah.
and specifically Children of Bodom.
Dimmu Borgir used the same stuff, like
kind of doing the same
Spiritual
stuff.
Black Dimensions use that and stuff. It's ridiculous.
It's an epidemic of graphic artistry in the late.
But I think as far as In Flames stuff goes, I think I'm more partial to the Kenneth Johansson photography based covers, like of Lunar Strain and Subterranean, than the later on stuff, just because it's so uneven.
Yeah,
like you'll have. I think as far like purely aesthetically, I think Whoracle is the best cover out of the bunch.
Yeah,
as far as like using like color theory correctly, and like it's just nicely composed, like rule of thirds, break up the windows, all that kind of stuff. But everything else is very uneven. When we get to Clayman, it's just kind of like, whoa.
There's just a lot. There's kind of a kitchen sink approach to all these sort of things happening. So, but Whoracle is kind of continues like sound wise what you heard on Jotun there, which is what'd you say, the Frost? Is it the Frost Trolls? Frost Giants? Is that what?
Norse giants.
Some kind of Norse giant type thing.
They're probably related to the Frost Giants.
Yeah, we'll just say for our sake, they're related to Frost Giants and Thor and other good fun stuff. But this record came out when I was a freshman in college, so I'm kind of pretty endeared to it because I don't know, that's just a time in your life, like living in the dorms, kind of things like this record and like
discovering who you are as a
Sin Piccato from Moonspell, as strange as that might be, just like there's like a few records that were coming out that like I kind of remember listening in my dorm room a lot, and this is one of them. And I think Jotun is like this, just like Stand Ablaze and just like Behind Space and just like Moonshield is this classic like album opener, and I think
they've been always really good at a solid, really grab you.
In fact, I'm pretty sure all the way up through Clayman, starting from Lunar Strain, we are going to be doing album openers from every record. Including Bullet Ride from Clayman and stuff like that. Which, so I mean, it's they know how to start a show. Like to really get it kind of things moving and stuff, and
catch your attention.
And this continues, I guess, the melodicism that you heard on Jester's Race. The same kind of thing, but I think they open up some different kinds of influences here that you'll hear,
vocally especially.
Yeah,
we're going like actually a little bit of the. Not Beauty and the Beast vocals, but more clean to I guess more of a hardcore influence to some degree. Or maybe just like going back to more like a thrash kind of influence, like some gang vocals,
kind of
and
gang
stuff like that.
Vocal sing along, and Monica and I were struggling earlier to come up with like a way to like describe that type of vocals that you'll hear like in Coerced, Coexistence, which we'll be playing a little bit later. And we kind of came up with what, like chant vocals,
like chant, shout.
Yeah, which kind of comes from like the Anthrax camp, you know, the Exodus camp, you know, that
New York hardcore based stuff.
Yeah, for sure, it's there. So, and I remember they opened up the whole show the first time we saw them with this song, Jotun. That was like their whole like set opener. I mean, I don't think they do that anymore because it was the era in which we saw them. But
surprised if they play much of anything off this record anymore.
Yeah, I know episode 666 is kind of like one of their standard songs, and that's kind of probably the only song they play off this record anymore, which is kind of too bad.
Great song.
You know? Yeah.
Well, this is the last record with Glenn. You know, one of the early founding members of the band, and this is the last record where there's that kind of like it's after this record you don't hear, there's like an undefinable Glenn sound that he brings to this weird kind of, and it actually goes into Dimension Zero, which he continues up until, what was the last record?
I can't.
2007. It was like,
I can never remember the song album titles for
some kind of lead or whatever, but they put out like 4 records, I think. Real solid stuff. But so this is like the last kind of like golden age In Flames before they kind of transition to what they'd later become with this more Cornish, new metalish vibe or whatever.
I think you can throw the Cornish kind of thing in there, but I think what you brought up with Glenn is this weird essential element. I think he's like the last anchor of harshness that's there. He's the last anchor of death metal, maybe, you know, and I think that's the major criticism that you start to get into with this era of In Flames, is whether or not they could even be considered in the camp of melodic death metal, or are they just melodic metal with some level of harshness to their vocals.
Sure.
And so it really does get questionable, especially after Whoracle. I mean, even Whoracle is probably up for debate to some extent, but I think a song like Episode 666 it's way more in your face than anything you're going to hear on Colony or Clayman. You know, it's just it's very like immediate and very like, you know, it's not just punchy and catchy, but it's like got a little bit of an edge to it, and that must be the Glenn element, because when you hear the stuff he does for like Dimension Zero is very harsh. It's very Eucharist.
It's taking the melodicism. Well, there's melodicism there, but it's like it's barbaric and in your face and harsh.
It's got some death metal to it. Yeah. And I mean, would you agree that like from everything gets a lot warmer on Colony forward? You know, it's a warmer tone to it. It's just, and there's nothing wrong with that because it works really, really well in Colony. But I feel like Colony's that weird tipping point of like, how much warmer can you get before you either repeat the same thing and just make Colony Part 2, or you have to actually start going into a more commercial area where you get into like things like Pinball Map, and you get like these attempts at, I don't know what you would call them.
There's more traditional songwriting happening, but also Frieden has done on Whoracle. He engineered or co-engineered and co-produced or co-mixed the records. Yeah. So I think you're really seeing his influence come into this stuff as far as the songwriting aesthetics and more anthemic, even to a different degree, more vocally anthemic than musically anthemic.
Yeah, I think that's maybe what it is, and you'll hear that in like, you know, Episode 666 and in Gyroscope. These like,
there's vocal hooks which we didn't really have.
Yep. You know, and I mean, even in like Moonshield, which we heard in the last part 1 of this, you know, like there are some vocal hooks, but it's like they're attempting to come out of the cocoon.
It's kind of the start,
yeah. And I think this just sort of picks up on it a lot more.
That's what, the first record, I think we're really like, where guitar and vocals, like they're on an even playing field. Yeah. Like they're both just equally as important to one another.
And where do you guys think that all this, you know, you hear so much harsh criticism, I mean, of this band. They're almost like, I'd almost put them in the same camp as like Cradle of Filth. You know, Cradle of Filth has people that really, like us, that would probably defend their first like 3 or 4 records pretty well.
3 solidly.
Yeah, 3 solidly. I would defend Cruelty and the Beast, which is like, well, I guess that's their 3rd full length. So you know, Vampire, the EP.
At least Midian was decent, but but I think In Flames is much more of a interesting band as far as they're not a one trick pony. Like Cradle of Filth is what you see is what you get. You hear Dusk and Her, or what was the first record?
Principle of Evil Made Flesh.
That you hear that record, that's the template for everything they'll do in their entire career. It just gets more bombastic or symphonic,
pompous.
But basically that's what they are. They're like, okay, scream, 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 do some kind of interlude with some spoken word. They've never really, anything that was on that record, they've never deviated too much from it. In Flames have wildly deviated, although so has bands like, you know, Catatonia, but Catatonia have been more I think, artful about it and not as commercially driven as it seems that In Flames are.
Their choices made more sense.
Yeah.
What Catatonia did. Sometimes the choices In Flames made to the extreme metal crowd seemed like kind of like question mark, like what? Like why would you go that route? You know, like you could go this way, but you went that way. Like that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, because not because I'm like, oh, I like them when they're harsh and death metal. I think their new stuff's, you know, stupid and retarded or whatever. I just think like I can stand back and say like objectively, even if it's like poppy and kind of goofy, I can still say it's good.
Yeah, like,
but some of the new stuff is not good. Like it's really 50-50, like almost like pandering to a certain demographic. Some of it I think is inspired and I can get behind it, but a lot of it is just like I don't know. I just don't think they're really firing all cylinders anymore. Like what they need, like a punch in the arm.
I'm kind of a rare case because I came in on Clayman, and I was very aware of that in the underground metal community. It was a pretty controversial album, but I really liked it because that was my first exposure to it. But I've personally pretty much written them off, Reroute to Remain and On, because I don't like that commercially driven aspect they've taken. I mean, 2005, I was reading this earlier, they toured with bands like Soulfly and, you know, stuff like that. So it's just kind of, you get that, you know, I don't want to say lack of artistic integrity, because you can do whatever you want, but it's such a big change from my favorite part of that band.
The funny thing is the new Soulfly record's actually good.
I think I heard that somewhere.
Really?
I don't know if I believe that, but...
No, I've heard it.
You've heard, really?
Yeah, and I hate Soulfly. I've hate everything they've ever done. And like I was reading an interview with him, not to go completely off track here, but he was listening to a bunch. What the hell's the singer's name?
Max Cavalera.
Yeah. He was listening to a bunch of Morbid Angel and like Massacre and that era stuff. So it's like really, it's like old Sepultura. It's good.
Nice.
So,
and I mean, back to the roots a little bit.
Certainly, Max has the talent to pull it off. You know what I mean? Like he was, it was never a doubt of like this is the wrong guy to like. It was just he was way more into the whole new metal shit. You know,
which made him be much more successful doing that. Which I'm not gonna begrudge him for doing that. But it's cool to see a band that I hated to go like three. It's almost like the anti-In Flames, to where they started out great and they progressively gotten less and less interesting to me, and then a band that I hated from the get-go to flip around the other way
and actually become interesting at a certain point. Yeah. And I don't know what it is, you know, like, because I think it's a really great career move to go on tour with Soulfly. You know what I mean? Like, if you want to expose yourself and sell some more records and things, and it's just...
Well, like the recent... me and Monica just saw Mastodon, Opeth, and Ghost. Yeah. Which, when you say those three bands together, it's like... That seems like a weird fucking lineup, but...
It was great.
It's perfect. Yeah. Ghost, you know, is this band that has a lot of like buzz around it right now. Nobody really knows much about them.
And they're getting a lot more exposure because of this tour.
And then Mastodon appeals more to mainstream, but yet Opeth has just as much exposure, but two different crowds, and then you bring those two together, and it's okay, this is what we need to see tours being like now.
Yeah. You got some prog people, some traditional metal people, some little extreme.
There's like this 50-year-old guy screaming Opeth behind us, and then a bunch of kids.
And these kids are watching Ghost and just going, "Oh my god, what is this? This is amazing!" And then they're like tweeting about it and posting Instagram photos, like, you know. That was the first time I got to see Ghost, and I was just like a little kid. I was just giggling. I'm like, "Oh my god, this is the best show ever!"
For having one record out, they've managed to like, okay, we got, you know, because they're on Rise Above, so like, you know, me and Jason and a handful of other people knew who they were right at the get go, and then the next year there's this another crowd. The next year after that, you know, this is almost going on almost like it's
like 2.5 years.
2.5 years. So we've got like, you know, the Pitchfork crowd is starting to come around to like. Who's this Ghost band? It's weird how they've got like this huge grasp of people.
And Monica got to be part of you got to be part of our Thanksgiving Ghost celebration. We had a big Thanksgiving meal here like 2 years ago, and we were doing like Ghost karaoke and like all kinds of crazy stuff.
With a 5-year-old.
With a 5-year-old.
And a Norwegian.
And a Norwegian. I mean, you couldn't ask for more, you know. It was Ghost is a kind of band that brings everybody together.
Exactly.
Yeah. And speaking of Ghosts in Sweden, In Flames.
So, back to focus.
Yeah, and so we've got a nice variety of different songs coming up here from Whoracle. And I think that's what I like the most about Whoracle. It like Jester Race, it's this great variety of different types of songs everywhere. You know, Jotun is a little bit more like punchy in your face, which we just heard. Gyroscope, which we're going to hear, has some of these acoustic parts. It's kind of the Moon Shield, which is this template that they create on each record, a kind of a Moon Shield type song. But it's also got these really great kind of guitar swaggery back-to-back solo stuff happening near the end that we were kind of commenting on.
I think that's the Glenn factor is that if you go back and like you hear that swagger after Whoracle, it's not there anymore.
Yeah, it's more.
I have a feeling that he was like the swagger part of the of the equation, but Gyroscope also has like some really great like vocal stuff happening too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
talking about all these, all this variety. It's interesting you say that because they're telling a story. Literally,
you were saying that it's
a concept album.
And what's the basic concept?
The basic, he seems to be this kind of philosophical guy, and so it's just his kind of take on humanity's direction. So I know that
like Jotun, the inevitability of like we're going to kill her, we're going to destroy ourselves.
Exactly. Yeah. With Jotun, the giants, he's basically talking about our the big buildings that we construct and everything that we do to
corporations and environmental destruction.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then and I guess around like the Jester, the Hive, we've reached this sort of like utopia, I guess, and then we ruin it, and that's episode 666 is
kind of the rapture. Yeah.
So I guess that's his kind of concept.
Kind of thing, yeah.
I mean, that's loose interpretation, But
and I don't think they sold this as a hard concept record, but it's cool that there's a pattern there. Yeah.
So and then musically, it's the same thing. It varies to tell the story.
Yeah.
And I've never really delved too deeply into Frieden's lyrics. I know
you can't really read them on that.
There's 1997.
Unless you can read Children Bodum logo or style text.
But yeah, like with lyrics, I don't follow lyrics so much. So when they stand out to me when they're terrible, and these are not terrible, so I let them, let them go. But there's a band like Paradise Lost is one of those bands that I think Nick Holmes is a brilliant lyricist. He does his own. He's not really too philosophical about anything. He doesn't really have any kind of like grand idea outside of just like misery behind everything. But he has a really good be able to like turn a phrase.
Same with Jonas from Catatonia. It's kind of like misery and somberness, and you can kind of all relate to it. It's a human element. So, but even like a song like after we play Gyroscope, we have one of the two instrumentals we're going to play Dialogue with Stars, and that tells a story musically. This is probably like you said the triumph before the fall of humanity.
Yeah.
It's a very uplifting kind of tune. And
the peak of utopia.
I was telling these guys a funny story. I did an English 201 or English 101 class I had as a freshman in college. I did a presentation on mixtapes to my class. Mixtapes. This dates me a little bit. Not mixed CDs.
Was this?
97, 98. Yeah.
Okay, that was still when they existed. Yeah, you could go buy a TDK 90-minute tape.
Yes, you could. And I played some samples of some different things and made an actual mix for my professor, who was this like middle-aged like kind of woman, kind of nothing metal about her at all. Yeah. Trust me, like glasses and short hair and just like you're not just that average like your perception of like what a 40-year-old like just woman who's unmarried probably looks like. Just like living their thing or whatever. And she loved Dialogue with Stars. She just said she worked out to it all the time and stuff. And then we transitioned to the aforementioned episode 666, which is a little bit more harsher, less triumphant, definitely darker, more in your face. Has a great like kind of almost like Catatonia Brave Murder Day minor breakdown in it, which is kind of pretty hip. And then we'll sort of close out with the Whoracle record with the title track Whoracle, which is a nice way that the record kind of ends on a calm after the storm, maybe post-apocalyptic kind of dust settling vibe. It's
I would definitely say it's sad. You know, it's despondent, I think, and I really like the use of, because it's pretty much an instrumental, but we were saying it's got that
female vocals kind of working
that kind of harmonize it, and it kind of gives it that depressing sort of.
But there's no lyrics. It's just the
feeling,
the
vocal
like
instrument kind of working.
Haunting. That's perfect. That's what I was looking for.
And then we'll close out with our first song from Colony, which includes a nice little Weezer breakdown that we'll talk about when we come back, and that's Zombie Inc. Enjoy.
Not to be confused with Cadaver Inc.
Yeah. That was Zombie Incorporated, Whoracle, episode 666, Dialogue with Stars, and then we started things off with Gyroscope, and the vast majority of that...
Or Gyroscope, depending on how you...
It could have been Gyroscope, yeah. From the Whoracle record. And I guess we should mention alongside the Whoracle record was a nice little single that...
Well, that's from Just Erase, dude.
Was it?
Yeah.
It must have come out after it because it had Gyroscope on it. And it had...
Yeah, it came out after it.
Okay, so it was the bridge.
Because it still has the Just Erase artwork, but they took off half of the little...
Well, it was 97,
tank.
So it was in between. Because this was 97 as well, I want to say. Yeah. That was beautiful. Oh, yeah, both 97. So I guess it was right before the kind of precursor to Whoracle. But it was the... Nuclear Blast was doing the shaped discs, and it's in the shape of the jester face, much like the Hypocrisy turkey.
Chicken,
yeah.
And then there's the
dissection... where Date Agents Lie.
Yeah.
I would have liked to have seen that.
Yeah,
I've got it.
Yeah, we can show you.
Awesome.
Yeah. And in our interim, in between periods, we took a brief food break, and we were graced so wonderfully with, once again, that metal show's brilliance. I'm sure some of you
The definitive top 5 list
of the best albums of the past century, the 2000s. And in case you didn't know, it was Hatebreed, Perseverance, Buck Cherry, some bullshit thing. Exodus, Temple of the Damned, Anthrax, Worship Them, Worship Him, or Music, Worship Him, Samael, yeah, sorry, which is actually a great record. And then, but I don't know, top 5 of the century. And then what was the?
I don't know, top 5 of the.
What was
year.
number 1? I just forgot.
Number 1 was Accept.
Oh, Blood of Nations. Yeah, in case you didn't know that. Yeah. Because I'm sure you were all thinking Accept Blood of Nations was the best album of the past 12 years.
Yeah.
So there you go. We're here to bring you just pure knowledge, just like that metal show. So that thoroughly got up.
We do not have Michael Schenker here, but whatever.
That thoroughly boiled their blood a little bit. Colony, though, this is a kind of a big deal record. I think the three of us can all agree that this is, the last big deal record for all three of us, that all three of us kind of really got into.
It's the last good start to finish. In Flames, where there wasn't any iffiness,
questionable moments. Yeah. And like you said, now that Glenn's gone, it's a higher level of melodicism. But even so, like a song like Zombie Inc., which has the sort of Weezer breakdown, the kind of weird Say It Ain't So kind of acoustic kind of interlude, which leads into a pretty badass solo. I mean, just a lot of soulfulness and different things kind of happening there.
Well, Colony is kind of the big disruption of what was kind of the core In Flames lineup. I mean, we've got Bjorn going from drums to guitar at this point.
And they brought in Daniel from Sacrilege, right?
Yep, Daniel Svensson comes over onto drums. Then Peter Iwers, which apparently didn't really do anything that we could find.
Other than being the brother of
Anders Iwers from Tiamat.
Yep.
And then, Glenn exits and forms Dimension Zero at this point as well.
Yeah. And I feel like Colony Colony to me felt like the biggest In Flames record at the time. It felt like everybody I knew was into this record, but maybe it was just within our group of friends, but it just seemed like it attained a huge mainstream kind of status that to me it was the first time they came over and toured America, which was a big deal. There was just a lot of things kind of happening around that record. This is your era, right?
And I think this was the record when they came and they played Milwaukee Metal Fest and stuff like that, so they had some exposure to people who were into all sorts of different genres too. And they were touring with Nevermore on the Dead Hearts kind of tour, which I think was 99, 2000, the same era as Colony. Okay. Pretty much.
Because Colony's 99.
Yes.
Yeah, because I had it in Italy. And I went over to Italy in January 2000, and so it was one of the select albums that I had
pre-iPods
for the 6 months that I was stuck there. So I was really endeared to it. And I was telling Monica earlier, I just remember when I hear a lot of these songs, it just reminds me of walking medieval streets with the Discman, kind of funny.
I love those albums that have those moments where you listen to it and you just think of this special time in your life that you associate that music with.
Mine was I was working at a gas station.
That's when I would come in. But the best part of when Mark was working at that gas station is you would go in and it was the metal gas station.
I'd be playing it over the speakers. I'd be playing metal stuff.
Yeah, that's awesome.
It'd be like that, Primordial. Some Paradise Lost,
Blind Guardian.
There was a lot of there was
a lot of Sentenced and stuff at that point too.
Yeah, that was a cool era for sure.
This was me not being able to wait to get out of high school so I can go home, sit on my computer, and see what had downloaded the night before on my phone line.
Nice.
Yeah, we were kind of debating, talking about that when we went to go pick up the food for our food break we just mentioned, and I was saying, with you and I at that time were kind of part of the record store contingency, and so downloading was strange to us. It almost felt counterproductive, we were putting ourselves out of business or whatever. But this generation,
I didn't buy an iPod till 2005.
Well, but there was, but even MP3 players and different things. But your generation, which was just below us, that was a big component of how you guys. That was your tape trading. That's how you guys kind of.
That's how I discovered all this music was Napster and Audio Galaxy. I love Audio Galaxy. Yeah. Audio Galaxy. That was one of the coolest websites because it was kind of you went on there and you would download music and you could not become friends with people, but it was almost this social networking thing where people could send you files based on what you liked as well.
Yeah. Okay.
It was a really cool idea.
So kind of like tape trading in a sense, which is cool.
Yeah.
And I said the great hypocrisy of our elitist attitudes towards downloading is we did everything in our power to not have to pay for records by getting promos. So we were.
But we gave a service back.
Yeah,
we either did reviews
sure,
or there's.
But we felt justified that we didn't want to spend money if we didn't have to.
Oh, absolutely. I still feel that way.
There's a hilarity to
physical
that.
promos are.
And for the record, I did go to my local record store order the albums.
So you were just sampling them to see if it's something you liked, and then
exactly.
But so I mean, this is a changing. Metal is very much changing by the late '90s, early 2000s, and I think for love them or hate them, In Flames were on the cusp of this, along with Opeth, I think, and I think there were a few other European metal bands that kind of got caught in this wave, and I think have taken some.
Amon Amarth, you could throw in that.
Maybe Amon Amarth. They're just these Meshuggah. Mm-hmm. There's a time when Meshuggah was touring with Tool, and things like that, and so there were these Swedish, not Swedish, but just European metal bands that somehow got this like opportunity to become big here, and I think those bands often get slagged or punished for it, in a way. And I think the other thing that works against In Flames in this era is as we mentioned before, the rise of metalcore. Metalcore, like from about like 98, 99 up through like 2002, 2003 just became this force,
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of the template was on the back of At the Gates, but to some extent there were these In Flames-ish kind of moments of melodic catchiness that was built into some of the breakdowns or whatever.
I think In Flames is one of the bands that kind of came from the genre that kind of helped really kind of create what metalcore was in its core, but actually embraced what that metalcore kind of audience or those groups actually did and incorporated in their own music, which was kind of nobody else was really doing that at the time.
But do you think that
they seem to embrace that culture wholeheartedly?
But I mean, I guess, do you think that that's maybe one of the reasons why In Flames kind of became so controversial around this time of Colony, in that people were holding that against them, that they were inspiring this whole like new wave of second wave of American metal that was going on with Shadows Fall and all that kind of stuff?
Well, a lot of those Swedish bands that started out, Arch Enemy and Soilwork and In Flames, they have all of these great albums leading up until their fourth, fifth album, and then start getting a lot of exposure, and then start like scaling back. And I mean, I don't want to say dumb it down, but
we can. The Haunted did it as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Haunted put out like three really good records, and then it was.
Because it's frustrating, and then you just want to say fuck you to all of these bands because you're like, no, I want to keep listening to that stuff that made you popular to begin with.
Yeah.
Another band we were talking about earlier that was like of this same ilk, they kind of made that same pattern, was like a Soilwork. Soilwork, those first couple records had some nice like Carcassisms mixed with the melodic death metal.
Yeah, up until was it Steel Bath Suicide, Predator's Portrait was the
third one, and that's when like they just, you could tell like vocally they were starting to like spread out a little bit and test the waters, but he didn't have the vocal ability to actually do it.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing that like Pinball Map will do like on Clayman, where you're like, oh, I don't know if I really like where he's going with his vocal approach.
Cringe moments
for sure.
And I don't know, but
Dark Tranquility even did it on Projector, but then they were smart enough to pull back and go in a different direction.
Yeah, and I'm not going to begrudge anybody for experimenting with new stuff, but I think people should push their boundaries of what they can do as artists. But if you're a death metal singer and you can't sing, don't try to sing. Be a death metal vocalist. That's the biggest complaint. Yeah. You can experiment more in your music, but if you can't sing well, why make me sit through your excruciating record?
Yeah.
Well, what about just like a level of self-awareness? Because there's, we're kind of cutting it off at Clayman here, but you talk about Reroute to Remain and all of the latter In Flames albums, and there are cringeworthy Jonathan Davis whiny moments on all of these albums, and it's just
it gets more and more pervasive as they go.
Yeah, exactly. You would just hope that maybe somebody would be self-aware enough to be like, I don't want to sound like that when I used to sound like this.
And I mean, maybe some of the people, some of you guys that are listening to us, if you have some insight, I guess, in terms of like this later era, or some kind of justification for what In Flames is doing, because maybe you're even younger than the three of us, and you came in on soundtrack to your Escape or whatever. I get that, because they might have been one of the only Swedish metal bands you ever saw live, because they were playing these aforementioned festivals and things like that. So, it could have been a different kind of gateway for you at a different era, and is what it is.
That's exactly the difference between like maybe you and I. You came in right at the beginning. I came in Clayman, so I still like Clayman.
Sure,
but I
understandably
have a hard time stomaching and appreciating a lot of their latter stuff.
Yeah. And we were talking about it in the car ride over or to get the pizza, like about Machine Head and like Fear Factory, and how like that's something like her and I can kind of agree on those early records, but you even go a little further with Fear Factory and Machine Head than I'm comfortable with. And then for you and Chris, you guys had put them into a camp that I would probably argue they don't really belong in, but in your mind, I understand why you put them in that camp, because you just were like, this is all happening in America, and it was like a blob, You weren't you weren't really like looking at certain, because you were more interested in the European stuff at that point.
Yeah, and I wasn't interested really in what they had to offer.
Exactly.
Like Machine Head, I think has gained more validity in my mind in recent years, because they've kind of brought back thrash, but with a new kind of edge to it.
Yeah.
But some of that early stuff, it was more like chunky Pantera kind of stuff, which you and Chris were pretty much done with after Vulgar.
And I get that. Whereas like I remember being a freshman in high school and going and buying Far Beyond Driven the first week it came out, and being so like, because I was a freshman in high school, that was a heavy fucking record in ninth grade, and that was like #1 on Billboard, which was kind of a big deal at the time for a record that heavy. But yeah, so I guess it that's the weird part about a band like In Flames, that there's going to be the people like Mark and I who came in on the Lunar Strain kind of stuff, and then like quickly kind of start to fall away by Colony, Clayman era, and maybe people who came in, like you said, more in the mid period, and then there's probably people that have come in this sort of later period, But I mean, I don't know. Like I still love Colony. Like you said, it's a solid record from beginning to end. There's not like a dud on here. And there's not really a cringe-worthy moment that I can think of.
When it comes down to it, though, is if I were to show somebody else In Flames, I wouldn't choose to show them something off of Clayman or maybe even Colony. I would probably choose to show them something off of Jester Race or
Whoracle. Yeah, yeah. I guess it depends on their metal pedigree. If they were like kind of leery of like extreme metal, I might throw out the Embody the Invisible or Zombie Inc. or something like that. That has like a lot of catchy moments, and it's not too threatening,
They are very good for that. They are definitely one of those gateway bands. Like, you can always go backwards with them. So like you're saying, probably especially these younger kids, because right now their demographic is like 14 to 18 year olds for the most part, I think. So their music is,
it should be unfortunate when you're like in your early 40s.
Yeah, that you're trying to really mass appeal like 15 16 year olds. Yeah,
but if then they can go, oh, this band is so great, and then segue into stuff like Jester Race and Whoracle, and just get like a variety and hear some things that they've never heard before, and maybe been exposed to before.
And maybe trade in your The Devil Wears Prada and Whitechapel CDs for an older In Flames CD, perhaps.
I wonder what the guys on that metal show think about modern day In Flames. I bet they're. I bet Jim Florentine's a fan, and that's enough street cred, there. But so kind of getting back, I guess, into some of the Colony stuff. I think too, this is also like I feel like at this point, and you and I were Monica and I were chatting about this. I think Mark, you were downstairs getting something about how I really feel like In Flames starts to get into competition with Arch Enemy in the early 2000s, kind of for like commerciality, but also like outdoing each other with some of the guitar work and stuff. Yeah, and Colony's like a great example of like they're sort of going up against what Arch Enemy's about to release, which is Wages of Sin, which is kind of the, I don't want to say comeback record, but it really re-announced Arch Enemy in a more commercial way.
Yeah, new vocalist. I guess at that point it was kind of like a novelty for there to actually be an attractive female vocalist that was actually singing death metal and not like being like.
But I think the music was pretty reinvigorated as well. Like, they seem like more like committed to it rather than kind of like this post-Carcass project,
and definitely a bit show-offy for sure. They were flashy. They wanted to show their chops. To everybody.
Yeah, Mike and Chris, they definitely. The Ahmad brothers,
they know how to guitar wank.
Yeah,
for sure.
They do. So, but so I think this is all kind of going on in that era, and so it's a weird time, But so we've got another great album kicker offer, which is Embodying the Invisible, and then another instrumental, which Pallar Anders Visa, and you said it. What did we kind of come up with?
It translates to Anders the Thief.
Anders the Thief.
I think you said.
Okay. Yeah. So
isn't like some kind of like
I think it's built on a traditional folk kind of thing, right?
It's like some sort of like Swedish, traditional song
ballad.
And then this will go into Coerced Coexistence, which is kind of has a cool thrashy solo in it, more thrashy than most of the other stuff going on Colony. And then we'll sort of end with Insepid 2000, at least for the Colony record. And Insepid 2000 is kind of just a personal favorite. And I was telling you that what I think they achieved really well, better than a lot of bands, is what did I say? An immediate momentum. I termed it really well. It was like they just have this like really nice momentum to a lot of their songs. That's very condensed and I don't know. There's something about the first half of Insepid 2000 that's really punchy.
It really grabs
and catchy
you.
And kind of grabs you, and that's something they're really good at. They do it in Bullet Ride. They do it in other kind of mid-era In Flames kind of stuff. And then we're going to transition into the beginning of some Clayman stuff with Brush the Dust Away, Swim, and Bullet Ride, and we can kind of chat a little bit more about Clayman and kind of how we close the doors for In Flames when we come back. So enjoy.
What is written in the soul?
That was Bullet Ride, Swim, and Brush the Dust Away from Clayman. And then before that, we had Insepid 2000, Coerced, Coexistence, Pallar, Anders Visa, and we started with Embody the Invisible.
Isn't Insepid 2000, isn't that like Rob Zombie's brother's band?
Power Man 5000. Yeah, well, it's interesting you mentioned like kind of some of those, there are kind of white zombieism, electronic, experimental sort of things starting to like filter into the music on that song in particular, but they kind of throughout the totality of what In Flames is going to do. As as we were sort of saying, In Flames with Clayman and stuff is starting to become more and more Americanized, maybe. More interested in appealing to more the American crowd rather than fitting like into the Euro metal crowd.
Well, more rhythmic based than say like melodic, harmony based like they were before. Yeah,
and I was, we were talking before, and I mean this might be an off base comment, but I think in this they were really thinking about rhythmic stuff in the sense that like way Meshuggah was thinking about it, and maybe they were modeling the success that Meshuggah was starting to have over in America off of, hey, we need to like sell that part more to, I guess, a hip-hop sized America in the early 2000s. Slipknot was very rhythmic and was like all about beats and percussions. I mean, even to some extent, like, and I do enjoy certain eras of System of a Down, but they do have also a rhythmic kind of thing going for them too. That they seem to sell that more than the European like soloing like twin leads, and that's very much a British, new wave British heavy metal, Teutonic kind of thing going, and they kind of start to move away from that with every album almost,
I think the rhythmic thing is, I mean, it's interesting and important to some degree, but if you can't capture me with, like, if every song sounds the same, after a while it's like, I don't care if you're playing a goofy like polyrhythm on the drums. If it's boring, I don't care.
But I think with Colony and Clayman, like they still have hooks enough. Most of the songs are still hooky enough that there's memorable moments and things. But I think you're commenting more on Meshuggah.
Just a thought. We're talking about how In Flames sort of became Americanized and how that's been really very successful for them. It's funny because we're speaking about this from an American perspective. So imagine this. We were talking earlier about how everybody in Europe is crazy for American style metal. So just imagine this band comes over here and they're crazy about all this music, and so they start, adopting this and then go back home, and then everybody else is crazy about it. It's got to be an interesting, like, I would be interested in hear what, somebody with a European perspective would say of In Flames' new route.
It's like the grass is greener scenario.
Yeah, and I wonder, I mean, I feel like they've won some Swedish Grammys and things like that, and they've got,
pretty sure they have,
acceptance in that sort of standpoint. So, and hey, like we said, more power to them. I mean, if
you can make a living out of it, then
I don't think at the end of the day I always say like, oh, In Flames is effing terrible. Like, there's nothing redeemable about them.
They've just wandered out of my taste zone at this point.
Yeah, and I think like a song like Bullet Ride, which we just ended the set with, is kind of an example of a late masterpiece of that band.
Yes.
I mean, it's definitely, to me, it's the highlight of Clayman. I think you argue the same.
Between Swim and Bullet Ride, like the intro on Swim is amazing too, but Bullet Ride, it's like the album starts out saying, I have something to say and I gotta tell you right now.
Yeah.
I raped your mother today. And it doesn't matter much to me as long as she's dead.
Yeah, and so
that's morbid.
Sorry, that's Misfits lyrics, dude. Come on.
And that's like Bullet Ride. I think what I was saying to you before, this is like right when I was kind of hosting the Furnace and stuff like that, which is ironic because I followed in the footsteps of Monica's boyfriend hosting this metal show that like we've so often referred to, and Mark used to come and do some guest DJing on there as well. So. We just didn't know Monica at the time because you were not in the realm yet.
Probably.
You were selling Girl Scout cookies somewhere, and ruling with Megadeth. But coming out, Bullet Ride, the way that it comes out of the solo, and it's almost like a kind of a rhythmic rapped kind of like harsh vocal line, but it emerges really well. It's a nice moment for sure. But then, we're going to sort of end things tonight with a nod to what happens after Clayman.
A better nod, I would say.
Yeah. It's an acknowledgement of what happens beyond. And certainly we all said we all own Reroute to Remain for whatever reasons. Mm-hmm. I haven't sold it, so.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that record was like really, I think they started to hit like a glut to where everything was like overproduced. This is stripped down. It's going back to a lot of the kind of ideas they had in the earlier records, but even more simplified and straightforward approach. And this is an example, I think, of Andrew's vocals that he's successfully doing, like a more melodic thing with the harsher, and it works. And it's not like the hiding in the bush crying, weak goth guy vocal like he ends up doing later on.
Yeah.
There's some of it in there, but
there is, but it's
some
not.
It's
enough to be respectable.
And you've got your standard kind of like Moonshield type template with like Dawn of a New Day, which is kind of their like, catchy, like mellow kind of song and stuff. And I think Trigger was a big song off this record.
Yeah,
it was a single and stuff like that.
That one.
Yeah.
So, so I mean, there's things that, work on this record, certainly.
It's kind of a guilty pleasure record, actually.
Yeah. And again, like we said, we would never fault these guys for what they've kind of done beyond, but it just sort of drifts off our radar screen.
Sure.
So, but it's a kind of a good way to close things out, and so, Monica, we appreciate you coming in and
thank you
throwing
bring your perspective. Yeah.
It was a lot of fun.
It's always neat to get a generational sort of outlook on this. But let us know what you thought. If we captured some of the songs that you liked, or maybe you have some controversial thoughts on In Flames, like maybe you're a closet.
If you think Come Clarity is the best record ever.
maybe you hate Subterranean and Just Erase, but you love Come Clarity. Let us know why, I guess. But maybe
or don't.
maybe don't actually. Just keep that. But shoot us an email at requiempodcast@gmail.com. Check us out on Facebook, Mark and Jason. Go to the website, requiempodcast.com, where you can be a donator to our executive
producer, which is the credit you can put on your resume, and which actually some have said they're putting on the resume.
Yes. And you're permanently on our website as the executive producer whenever that episode ever comes up. So that's something to be proud of, especially as the summer months approach and you're looking to celebrate something. That's a good thing.
Help celebrate metal.
Yeah, help celebrate metal. And also check us out on iTunes. Leave us a comment. We love getting star ratings and all that kind of good stuff. So, but it's been fun. So for In Flames and Reroute to Remain, this is Drifter. We're going to end with, I am Jason.
I am Mark.
I'm Monica.
Thank you.